such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. These are just in this predicates, coherent yet unknown names. Oh, can you put me in codes? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on one side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Apocalypse here for this live stream conversation that we're going to be doing this evening on freedom. And I'm thankful for both of our guests who have agreed to chat about this topic. And I want to thank those of you who are already on the live stream, watching this wherever it is, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. A couple things before we get started. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Click that little notification bell if you wouldn't mind, so you get notified whenever we post something or there's any sort of activity on the channel. And I appreciate all of you who have already subscribed to the channel. I'm very grateful for your support. So let's get started with this. And the way that I want to start this is just having both of our guests introduce themselves, and along with that, explain a little bit about why you're interested in this topic in particular. And we'll start with John Buck.
Sure. Yeah, my name's John Buck. I'm sort of on the Twitter philosophy of religion sphere, I guess. I'm a recent Catholic convert, actually, just this Easter. I don't know if that's going to be relevant at all to the discussion, but yeah, I've got I don't know, my interest in free will, I guess, sort of came from a time in which I was like very, I don't know, at a point where it's like not knowing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, but still a sort of deep recognition that like, no, there are still like moral things that I should be doing. And so like, I don't know, to me, it's almost like that sort of like principled normativity of like what I ought to do is a sort of basic fundamental truths that we have to live by, close to, a sort of epistemic certainty as like my own awareness of myself, maybe. I don't know. It's at least very close to there. So anyway, from that, I've had a strong connection, or I don't know, it seems like that in order to be made most sense of has to be done within a sort of libertarian framework. So I'll go into that a little bit later, but yeah, so that's why I'm, I guess, interested in the whole topic of free will.
Yeah, spicy stuff. Nice. Thanks, John. I appreciate you being here. Samuel, go ahead and introduce yourself and why you're interested in this particular topic.
Sure. So I'm a 23-year-old currently theology student. I studied my first degree in history, and then I'm studying in theology, focusing on biblical studies and historical theology mainly. So I don't have any kind of formal or even like excessively detailed interest in analytic philosophy, or in general, or analytic philosophy of religion in particular, although I'm generally aware of a lot of the developments, the broad contours of the, particularly, libertarianism versus compatibilism and all the different variants within those two camps. My interest in this topic of free will began, well, I'm not sure when it began, but it became more of a topic of more detailed reflection and systematic reflection after reading the works of David Bentley Hart. So, which eventually led me to becoming quite an ardent universalist, to spoil the end of the story. But like Hart, because he argued, you're probably aware in his book, That All Should Be Saved. But it began before that book, which was published in 2019. So like his earlier book, that The Experience of God, published in 2010. I'm not sure the exact date, somewhere around there, maybe 10 years ago now. That was very instrumental on my theology in general. So I'm not sure whether you read that book, John, but he structures it based off how there's three names for God: being, consciousness, and bliss, or Sat Chit Ananda, to use the Sanskrit phrase, right? And how these are not just names for God, but also ways we experience God in our, the third one, bliss, Ananda, is usually, the Hart describes that as the way in which the various transcendentals, to use the medieval terminology, goodness, beauty, and truth, for instance, the way in which they we are, it's kind of what you call an intellectualist account of, I'm not sure whether we probably were at Plato, Aristotle, but they have this what's often called an intellectualist understanding, where of freedom, where, and Aquinas also has this understanding as well, which I'm also influenced by. But it's basically an intellectualistic model of freedom. Is just one where it emphasizes the our apprehension of the good being based off the intellect, the emphasis on the intellect as opposed to the will. I mean, obviously they both work together in some kind of synergism, the intellect and the will. And I agree with that generally Catholic understanding of what we call synergism, working together, But where was I going with that? So yeah, I'm influenced by Hart's account of the transcendentals, and also by the way in which he uses that to argue in his last meditation of That All Should Be Saved about why it's possible. So this is like how, not to get into a bit like why this topic is important to me. It's not just because of the topic of universalism, although that's one of the main topics, but it's also because I think that eschatology influences the way we interact with the world in general, and all the other aspects of theology as well, right? So I think that it's important to have a coherent account of freedom, which has roots in what we can broadly call the Christian tradition, right? Because I do identify as a Christian, even if uneasily sometimes. But I want to also get past, and maybe we'll get into this in the discussion, but one thing I don't like about this discussion as a kind of outsider to this analytic philosophy, sort of field, is this dichotomy between libertarianism or libertarianism versus determinism, because, and maybe I'll get into this a little more detail later, but I think that well, in a nutshell, I think there's good good libertarianisms and bad libertarianisms, as well as good determinisms and bad determinisms. Okay. What I mean by that is that I think that when a lot of libertarians are concerned about causal determinism, whether that be, you know, based on past events or ultimately God, theological determinism, right? I think that a lot of their concern arises from a competitive understanding of agencies, you know, where God and human compete on the same level. You know, whereas I think that some notion of analogy, which is a kind of middle way usually between univocity and equivocity, right? Some notion of analogy is important to understand the relation between God's being and our being, and how they work together. And so that based off such an analogical account of God's being and our being, I think it's possible for God to determine us to freely choose. Right. I know that sounds like paradoxical, perhaps even contradictory, but that would be the good sense of determinism that I often think in terms of, right? Obviously, the bad sense would be the one that you obviously don't like either, you know, where you don't even have the ability to do otherwise. And I think that, and for the most part, we do have the ability to do otherwise. You know, it's often just called, like Maximus the Confessor just calls this the gnomic will, because which is predicated upon the natural will towards the good, but nevertheless we have the ability to deliberate, you know, to do one action as opposed to another. You know, I agree with all that. But I think that ultimately, as Augustine says at the beginning of the Confessions, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. So I ultimately think that someone cannot be free in any ultimately meaningful sense unless they become divinized, you know, attain theosis, to use the Greek language, right? And so in that sense, I think we are determined, God determines us to all be saved in a full sense of salvation, right? But I don't think that this is necessarily incompatible with what's often called libertarianism. I suppose it only be incompatible if you think, you can explain to this yourself, your own account, but I think it would only be compatible if you think that you need the ability to choose otherwise than God in the end, you know, as if God is an object among other objects whom we choose just like any other object, you know. Because of my classical theist understanding of God as not an agent among other agents, ultimately, right? I don't see any issue in universalism, basically, you know. And anyway, I've probably talked too much so far. But just, I thought it's probably necessary just to give you a general idea of where I'm coming from. It's not probably the exact same place as you, but at the same time, I probably have sympathy. Because you said you become a Catholic recently, and I'm, even though I'm a Protestant, I'm actually very much influenced by the Catholic tradition in many ways. So sometimes I might sound like a libertarian. I'm like a libertarian. But other times I might sound like a Calvinist determinate, you know, like because I am a universalist, you know, because right. Often libertarians, you know, they're like, oh, if you're a universalist, how can you must be a determinist, you know? But I just don't like this way of framing things. So hopefully that's helpful. Yeah.
Thanks, Samuel, for that. And you're hinting at stuff that we'll get into later on, hopefully, if we have time. All right. So I figured the best way to get started in this discussion is to turn things over to John and have you sort of lay out your account of libertarian free will. And I don't really have a sort of time limit on how long you should go, but just go until you feel like you've sort of explained enough for a continued conversation once Samuel kind of gives his account. So,
Sure.
yeah, John, why don't you go ahead and lay that out for us?
Yeah, sounds good. Let me. All right. So I think probably what can be helpful is to sort of lay out what are the different philosophical pathways or positions that we can take, because there's a few out there. There's a hard incompatibilist, which is the view that like we are not morally responsible for our actions in any sort of ultimate sense, because they are determined, or because moral responsibility isn't even compatible with indeterminism. So that would be a sort of like, if we were to have a sort of truth table, determinism, like moral responsibility, is incompatible with determinism or indeterminism. And then you can have a compatibilism, which is where moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. And then you can have a libertarian account, which is moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism. So anyway, yeah, and we should probably clarify also like what determinism is. So as I understand it, determinism is just this saying that like the prior state of affairs, or like how things are, will necessitate the particular later state of affairs, such that that later state of affairs could not have failed to occur. So like if you have A, then necessarily you have B following from that. Now, there's a couple ways in which to have determinism. Like you could have a sort of Spinozistic determinism where you have all possible states of affairs that are sort of flowing out from God or nature. Similar to, I think Platonism is somewhat like that, where like you have this emanation of all good states of affairs. So that would technically be a type of determinism where you could still have sort of or quasi contingent effects, but like a multitude of contingent effects. Anyway, that would be one sort of type of determinism. But an indeterministic account would be where pretty much the negation of that, where you have A, but that does not necessarily entail that B will follow from it. B could, like B or C could have followed from A. And so that's where I, as a libertarian, will want to sort of latch onto, because for one, I think that God has libertarian freedom. Like being omnipotent, he has the power to have done otherwise than creating our particular world. It's not like he's a sort of emanationist God where like he must create or anything like that. He could have refrained from creating. I'm a classical theist as well. I think that God is perfectly content in and of himself and does not require creation in order to like be satisfied at all. He is the summum bonum, the good itself. And so like if he needed to create, then the good would lie outside of himself. And so he would have to create something. And so he wouldn't be a perfect being. Anyway, so I think that God has libertarian freedom. And I also think that it's better, I guess, in a sense, for God to create libertarianly free creatures. Because for one, I don't think that God is the author of evil. I know this is a sort of like classic sort of criticism of Calvinism that like I can't overcome it. It's something that like, sure, you can make arguments about how like God has no moral responsibilities, being the summum bonum, being the ultimate good. God is the potter and like the clay. What does the clay have to say about how it's treated? I think it's just better that like we understand all evil and sin not to be the authorhood, or not to be authored by God, but rather by fallible creatures such as ourselves. Okay, so that's sort of laying out the positions and a little bit more my theological motivation behind that. And I'll say right now, like universalism, I think is compatible with libertarianism. Like you could have an understanding that like creatures, even creatures with libertarian freedom, will eventually come to choose God as their ultimate end, and so rest in God as like if you wanted to retain your sort of universalism while also being able to subscribe to libertarianism. Okay. I think, I do want to say, for a while, I sort of referred to myself as a semi-compatibilist, which is somebody like John Martin Fisher. He holds to this position as well, where he thinks that moral responsibility is compatible with determinism, but not free will. As free will is not compatible with determinism, and free will understood in the sort of libertarian sense, where the ability to have done otherwise. I I don't know. In a sense, I'm kind of like that because I do think that even if determinism is true, we're still going to have creatures that produce good or bad effects. And that's a sense in which you can say, okay, well, they produce this bad effect. They're responsible for producing that effect. And then maybe there's appropriate methods in responding to the agents that produce that bad effect. And I think that's a sort of like axiological normativism, where it's talking about good and bad rather than talking about right and wrong. Whereas I think talking about right and wrong, that's bringing in a sort of imperative sense of like, you should do this, you should not do that, you ought to do this, you ought not to do that, where we're bringing in a sort of stronger sense of normativity than just saying, oh, what you did was good or bad. Because like you can, like a child or an animal can produce effects that are good or bad, and we don't really consider them morally responsible. But if somebody knows what they should do and then they actively go against that, that's a moral sense in which they're doing something wrong in a stronger sort of sense. So that's the type of moral responsibility that I don't think is really going to be compatible with determinism. And I'll actually present my argument. It's super simple. I sort of laid this out to people before, so let me share screen. All right. I've added it. There you go. All right, thanks. All right, premise one. If I had ought to have done something, then I could have done that thing. This, I think, is probably going to be the most controversial premise, but it's basically the ought implies can principle, where if I ought to do something, then it must be the case that I have the power to sort of do that thing. Because for me, it's just somewhat absurd to say that I ought to do something that I'm unable to actually do. So like, let's say if like go back in time and kill baby Hitler or something like that. That's not something that I have an obligation to do at all, because that's like metaphysically impossible for me to actually accomplish. But like if ought did not imply can, then that sort of scenario could potentially be the case where like you have obligations to do things that are metaphysically impossible or physically impossible for you actually to accomplish. So that's a principle that I think pretty much any sort of normative theory is going to want to retain. So that's why, so this is just derived from that ought implies can principle. All right, and then premise two, I ought to have done something other than what I ended up doing. This, I think, is also going to be something that a lot of people are going to want to accept, where like there's instances where somebody ought to have done something and then they did something that they shouldn't have done. Like pretty much. So yeah, any normative theory is going to want to retain that principle as well. Or it's not even a principle; it's just a fact about basic morality, pretty much, where somebody does something immoral. And then from there, so we can entail from that. So I could have done something other than what I ended up doing. And so that's the sort of classic libertarian sort of basic, not principle, but proposition, that to have acted freely is to have done something that you could have done otherwise. The principle of alternative possibilities. Yeah. So that's my argument. I don't know, we sort of cleared some things up there. I'm curious, though, of your thoughts, Sam.
Yeah. I was reading. I think you mentioned this in your talk with Ben Watkins, if I recall correctly. But I think you cited. There's a chapter in the Routledge Companion to Free Will there's a chapter by Laura Ekstrom titled "Event Causal Libertarianism." Was that the title was that the chapter that you cited? Perhaps it doesn't really matter whether you.
Maybe. I'm an agent causal libertarian. I find event causal libertarianism kind of implausible, but
okay,
I may have been referencing that for something, I don't know. No,
it's fine. The reason why I just bring this up is because you'll often find that a pattern with me is that I don't want to emphasize just. So like in this particular case, the dichotomy is often between event causal and agent causal. I don't want to. I want to say both. And I'm a person who wants to find a middle way between often these positions. So I mentioned this just because I mentioned this chapter just because at the beginning she makes this interesting point. She says, typically, I'm just quoting from the chapter at the beginning. She says, typically free actions have been conceived roughly as those acts that both derive from the self and that are chosen from among alternatives. And she says that, so these two things, like derive from self and chosen among alternatives, are the two main kind of conditions that different theorists often emphasize one over the other, right? And that's, I only mention this just because I think there's a potential in your libertarianism, in its emphasis on having the ability to do otherwise, or on the principle of alternative possibilities, that you ignore this other condition that she's talking about free actions, those acts that derive from the self,
Right.
And this is often the element which the classically compatibilist accounts often like to emphasize. Someone is free if they have the ability to act upon their desires. That's usually like the usual definition you find in like Locke or Hobbes, or whatever. I mean, and that's obviously been refined by certain compatibilists in the 20th century. I've forgotten that guy's name.
John Martin Fisher, I'd say, is a great sort of defender of
Fisher. Yeah, but the other one I was thinking was
Dan Dennett?
Frankfurt. Frankfurt.
Yeah, Frankfurt.
Frankfurt. Yeah. He's kind of like a modified compatible. He's not usually like the classical. Yeah. But anyway, I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? What I've just said about like how perhaps can you see a potential worry and overemphasizing the ability to do otherwise, and de-emphasizing the other condition, which is an action is free if it derives from the self.
Oh, right. Absolutely. Yeah, like I think that sometimes libertarians sort of overplay their hand in a sort of sense where they want to say that in order for any action to be considered a morally responsible action of an agent, it must be the case that they could have done otherwise for that particular action. But like I can imagine a case where, like, let's say I drive, or like let's say I drink a lot of beer, get drunk, and then I go out on the road and then I run over someone. That would be an instance where while I'm driving, I don't really have the ability to stop the car or like handle myself well enough to avoid hitting that person. But the fact that I'm behind the wheel and driving, this is a sort of an event that takes place that produces some outcome in a deterministic fashion. Like the fact that I'm drunk, I'm not able to control myself. But it's still going to be ultimately, like going back down the chain, derived from some sort of choice that I as an agent made. The decision to drink enough beer and then remember in a circumstance where I could get out on the road and hit someone, something like that. So yeah, I think there needs to be I do think that you can be morally responsible for an event that takes place or an action that you do, even if in that particular moment you didn't have the ability to do otherwise. Only so far as what led to that was some sort of free action that was made by you in a principle of alternative possibilities sort of sense. Like if it was the case that I had a stroke or something that sort of inebriated me while I'm driving, and then I hit somebody on the road, that I wouldn't be morally responsible for hitting that person on the road because it's something that happened to me rather than something that I decided to do. Maybe, I don't know, if you wanted to say, well, I have a strong chance of having a stroke or something like that, then it would have been a sort of moral decision that I made that I could ultimately be responsible for. But let's just say, like, per hypothesis, that it's some sort of random occurrence that just happens to me. So anyway, I do want to agree with you that a person can be morally responsible for things that were determined by prior events, so long as those events ultimately work their way back to some sort of causal chain in which the agent decided to do an action that they could have done otherwise.
Okay. No, I don't have any issue with that in principle. My problem with what I understand to be an agent causal libertarianism is that it can often veer into some kind of mythology or fiction of the agent as like an enduring, unchanging self, or like an uncaused cause, or like a, as if it's God, as agent,
Yeah.
So I want to, as a classical theist, and as someone within the broadly classical theist tradition, I want to always emphasize that our freedom is ultimately dependent upon God's God's being.
I'd agree.
Right.
Like, as a strong classical theist, I am sort of committed to the position that for any action that takes place, the being for that action must have been provided by God. So that means that, like, if I do something evil, God was a causal source to that event taking place. Like, the only way that I was able to do that evil thing was because God is sort of contributing actuality to that event that I did.
Right.
And so I get how that's going to set up some alarms for some libertarians. And I think that the way in which to sort of understand that is that human beings have when they're making a free choice, they have the sort of ability to make it the case that so they have a sort of propositional control over what occurs, whereas they don't have the ability to provide the very being to those actions or events that take place. So, like, when I'm making a decision between choosing to give the homeless man $5 or refraining from doing that, either decision that I make, God's going to be providing the being to that decision, acting upon that decision, because I'm not a being of pure actuality. I derive my being from God, and I derive all of anytime I move or undergo some sort of change or anything like that, God is ultimately providing the being that's there in that change. So when I'm walking away from the homeless man, that's an instance where God is providing all of that. So, like, I definitely want to affirm a strong, I mean, it wouldn't be as strong as like strict Calvinists, but I do definitely need to, as a classical theist, accept a strong sense of sovereignty where for any event that occurs, God is the ultimate cause of its occurring. That without God, it could not have occurred at all.
Because that just gets into the question you raised earlier about you resisting God being the author of evil, right? Yeah. Which in some ways I want to resist as well, but yeah, let me just say, so make a point here. So I think that the anxieties or qualms that a lot of us have with God, with conceiving God as the author of evil, ultimately arise from viewing God in what I would consider, to use the language of Brian Davies, who's a Dominican, classical theist, you're probably aware of, in theistic personalist terms. So, as long as you view God as a person, right, as often a lot of analytic philosophy does, I think this image of God as the author of evil, much like he would be like, I don't know, the author of the novel, whose characters and their actions are ultimately, I don't know, a dystopia. That is if that's the genre of the novel, But I think that as long as you acknowledge that author is an analogical term, where, and there's obviously limits and discontinuities between any, in any analogy we make, there's obviously limits as well as discontinuities as much as there's continuities between the two things we're comparing, right? As long as you acknowledge all that with God, I think you can say, although tentatively, that God is the author of everything, which would include both good and evil events, but I understand though the reason why people resist the Calvinist picture is because, and instead they say that God permits evil events as opposed to directly cause. I mean, I understand. And I incline towards saying that as well, because I believe that as a classical theist that evil is privatio boni, privation of. Sorry, I said that wrong.
The privation, the theory of
evil is a privation of goodness, at which, and then goodness itself is convertible with being. You're fully aware of all that. Yeah. So in some sense, being, so evil is non-subsistent, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This is often people misunderstand this. So it just means that it doesn't exist in itself. It's always
parasitic on the good.
A parasitic upon some prior reality, which is goodness, being, all these other kind of positive transcendentals we can speak of, right? So I don't. So in other words, I don't disagree with this image of God as permitting evil events, but not direct. So you'd want to emphasize that God is indirectly causing evil, as uneasy as it often sounds,
Yeah. So I think that there's still, even saying that God only permits moral evils doesn't really get him off the hook in regards to natural evils. Like, I think God actually has to be the sort of author, in a sense, of natural evils that take place, but still in a sort of analogical sense, because there's no evil that exists in a natural evil. It's just a privation of good things that God creates, and he creates them in a way in which those natural evils can occur. I think in regards to treating God as a person, I'm still somewhat agnostic, I guess, on whether God has moral obligations or anything like that. But even if he didn't, I think that we'd still that doesn't just get God off the hook in regards to the evil that happens in the world, because we as classical theists want to say that God is the good, and the only things that he can do are going to be good things, and God is also all loving. And so if God is all loving, and the best understanding of loving that we have is God willing the good for another, then it seems that's still going to raise some problems for why we shouldn't expect God to be the author of evil. But anyway, so I guess I'm wanting to hone in on where we might really disagree, because something you brought up at the beginning was this sort of synergism that happens between God and man. And I definitely agree. I think there's some libertarians that want to say that God can't be the cause of any of our actions at all. But as a classical theist, I'm committed to God being a cause or a causal factor in regards to any of the actions that we perform. And the analogy I guess I have in mind is sort of a general sort of ordering his troops to go out on the battlefield. But in ordering his troops, those troops had to make the decision whether to obey their general or to disobey. And the general himself, he would know what those troops are going to do. Maybe, I don't know. I guess I'm not. Let's just say that he does know that, and he'll know that they're going to disobey, and so he's going to also have other troops to sort of send in their stead. Let's say maybe something like that, using a strong understanding of libertarian freedom, where God sends out the troops and they go away, and so God instead sends out other troops, or God, the general. So anyway, that's a sort of sense of synergism that I have in mind, of the general freely sends out his troops and the troops freely obey their general, or something sort of like that. I don't know if that's going to be a perfect analogy, but it's at least wanting to at least sort of retain that understanding of you can have providence without making God a monergistic sort of cause of all events that take place for a human.
And I understand this impulse to want to resist what you understand to be monergism. On a previous video that I did with John, I was discussing Eric Chavara's idea of analogia entis. I don't know sure whether you're aware of Chavara. He was a German Jesuit theologian who's often neglected. But I mention him just because he, in his day, was trying to combat these two extremes, theopanism and pantheism. So pantheism is where all finite reality is often just completely identified with God, and then theopanism, which is a notion that derives from an unfortunate caricature of what a lot of Indian Vedantist philosophy.
So would it be panentheism, where God is in all things?
So no, theopanism is literally God is all. So you know how, as opposed to pantheism, which is all is God, it's usually supposed to be the obverse.
Okay, I got
theopanism. So but Chavara thought that certain people in his day, most famously Karl Barth, who he was interacting with, were susceptible to theopanism because they subsumed. They didn't, in simple terms, they didn't acknowledge this distinction, this Thomistic distinction between primary causality and secondary causality. Or if they did, it was secondary causality was often viewed in terms of like a passive submission to the ultimate agency of God. You know, that's usually the worry people have, right? You lose that sense of activeness, really, and it's just all passive, right? That's the usual worry people have with obviously Calvinism, and usually now I don't think that so where am I going with this? So I agree with you that some kind of synergism has to be, some kind of synergistic understanding of God's relation to creation is in the ballpark of like the correct way of viewing things, right? But my worry with a lot of Catholic synergistic accounts of freedom is just that God is still viewed and on the same level, on the same plane. You know, God is, so you mentioned like before, like how God is, you know, in some senses a cause among other causes, you know, which is true, but you know, I like Shiva want to emphasize the ever greater dissimilarity for whatever similarity we make between God and creatures, you know, to use the language of the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215. And because I want to emphasize the ever greater dissimilarity between God and creatures, for whatever similarity, I don't want to I want to emphasize the problems or the limitations of any analogy we make. So like the analogy you just made earlier about like a general and you know, general and soldiers or people who follow him, like because the general worry with those kind of analogies for me is just that you there's a danger of, even if you acknowledge, like you assent to the proposition that God is infinite being, you know, being itself and all these other things, you know, there's a danger that you're in viewing God as a cause, even if so, the first cause. What does first cause mean? Like prima causa, you know, in Aquinas' Latin. You probably like aware how like it doesn't just mean like the first of a series, you know, horizontally. Right. You know, it has a transcendent, a whole. What am I trying to say? A vertical transcendent sense where the causalities are on different planes, right? But they're not so different planes that they have disconnection. You know, there's some connection between the two, obviously. You know, but where I'm going with this is, I think that, the problem idea of God as a person or an agent among other agents or whatever is that you collapse into univocal language. So ultimately, right. And you collapse both of the planes into the same plane. So where God's being and human being are, or God's free will, or God's freedom and human freedom is sort of in exactly the same way.
Yeah. And I think maybe the way to sort of retain a non-univocity between what we predicate of ourselves as agents and what God as the ultimate cause of everything is to make the distinction that, like, okay, all of our causes that we perform is going to be done in a sort of derivative sense. The fact that I could do otherwise is going to be derivative from the fact that God is actively providing being to me in this very moment. Whereas for God, he doesn't have that. He's not derivative at all. He's like, all of his causal powers is going to be non-derivative. Like he is the first cause of all things in a non-derivative sense, whereas we are the cause of certain actions or events that take place in a derivative sort of sense. And so that's a way to sort of clarify what the distinguishing, like, even though we're using I'm a cause and God's a cause of certain events or actions that take place, there is going to be, I'm using it analogically, because when I say I'm a cause, I'm using I'm a cause only in a derivative sense, whereas with God, he's a cause in a non-derivative sense.
Yeah, so I think we certainly have to make these kind of distinctions. Distinguishing between what does it mean for God to cause things and what does it mean for humans to cause things. There's obviously, I mean, or more broadly, like, the minimal condition that often an analytic philosophers of religion emphasize in defining God is that God is a necessary being, whereas we are contingent beings, But I want to go much further than this, though. I want to acknowledge although it's the case that we can view God in various anthropomorphic finite ways, as an agent, as an author, as all these other limited ways, although it's the case that we can do that while at the same time making qualifications and saying that it's kind of like an apathetic negation, sort of saying God is like an agent, yet not like us, who who's have all these limitations as finite agency.
Right.
Now, but I'm not sure that, but I want to, because I'm a very apathetic classical theist, so someone influenced a lot by Pseudo-Dionysius, who in turn influenced obviously Aquinas and stuff. But these people, they want to go further and say that God is beyond being. In Greek, this is hyperousios. And Aquinas actually says the same thing, because he's actually he's reliant on Dionysius in many places, and he also and so he also like has his places in like the Summa Contra Gentiles and other places where he says that God is beyond the order of beings. Right. So, but one important qualification to make is, though, is that ousia in Greek, it means like a finite essence or an agent. So like to say that God is beyond being doesn't mean that he's not real. This is often, how often people have misunderstood or caricatured like this understanding is like incoherent, like you're just speaking nonsense, gibberish. How can God be beyond being? You say that God doesn't exist. But then I would usually say to that in response, cleverly, that yes, God doesn't exist if the word exist means etymologically to stand out, as as an object,
as like a particular object or something like
a concrete
that.
particular object. So I only mention this because I don't want to, on the one hand, view God as an abstract universal, but I don't, on the other hand, want to emphasize God as a concrete particular.
Yeah.
I want to have a middle way between those two things, right? So when I say that God is
concrete universal, maybe.
Yeah, so there's a language that William Desmond, who's a continental philosopher, often uses called the intimate universal, which is a phrase I quite like. But yeah, anyway, so that's just one way of trying to grasp it. This idea that God is infinitely transcendent yet infinitely immanent and intimate, within our every act of every being, right? yeah, and that's what I wanted to like always maintain this this both and, or this neither nor, you know, kind of dynamic.
I wonder if we can sort of wind our way back into this topic of free will, and maybe like engage with the argument that I laid out somewhat, just so that I have a better understanding of like where your points of disagreement might be, or where your points of agreement might be. So if we want, we can share that on screen again, just because I brought this up to Ben Watkins, and he was very much wanting to sort of affirm both premises here, and so it's like a little bit frustrating. But like his understanding of the conclusion is in a sort of hypothetical sense, where like with the sort of qualifier, given a different set of antecedent conditions, I could have done something other than what I ended up doing in this world. But I'm curious, like, what are your sort of thoughts on this argument? And
well, I don't disagree with it. I mean, I agree with the Kantian principle. I mean, I don't. Ben's account is usual, I think it's some kind of classical compatibilist account, isn't it? Yeah.
It seems like he's mostly coming from Daniel Dennett's sort of defense of
and I would consider that to be a bad type of compatibilism, or a bad determinism. I because I'm not obviously like a naturalist or physicalist, and I don't, you know, believe that the sense of determinism is like arising from, you know, mindless or purposeless kind of processes and that sort of thing. And yeah, so that's why I like to like distance myself from like what people often think of compatibilism.
So how do you understand compatibilism? Is it just that like our actions are in a way God's working through us?
Yes. So that would be one way to understand like a theological determinism or theological compatibilism, I guess, is to view God as like a big self who works his purposes and desires within humans, you know. But you can already see the problem there with viewing God as like a big self, because it just makes us seem like we are puppets.
Yeah.
You know,
that's at least the image I always have in mind when in talks about theological determinism.
And so and I want to avoid that though, because I'm vehemently against at least most accounts of like what Calvinism is often portrayed, whether or not that's accurate to like Calvin's view or not. You know, and so I that's why I find like the author novel analogy slightly more helpful than this like puppeteer kind of, you know, analogy, which is kind of like supposed to be like a reductio ad absurdum of like,
right. But like even then, like if I write a novel about someone who like exterminates the entire human race, like there's not real consequence to my writing that novel. Sure, it's an interesting story, but the reason there's no consequence is, well, they're fictional characters. But you and I, we're not fictional characters. We actually have being to us, and so there is a consequence if God wrote a novel in which the entire human race was exterminated.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with that. Although I don't know what I put another can of worms by identifying as an idealist necessarily, but if I suppose that while I acknowledge the limitations to that analogy of the author novel, because we are not fictional fictional entities, and whereas the characters in the novel are, I think that there's some sense in which we, because we are wholly dependent upon God, in which we can say that God's that we are I don't know, but I don't want to say we're fictional characters, but we are, in some senses, yeah, we're characters who are wholly dependent upon God's being, right? And also, I don't like dividing God's being into like God's being, God's will, God's knowledge. You know, like people often think of like God's, you know, omniscience, omnipotence, and all these other omnis, whatever. But yeah, I think you can also say that granting that divine simplicity is true and that all of that God's will, God's knowledge, God's goodness are all, you know, are all ultimately unified or identical with each other. I think we can say that with many qualifications that we are like the fictional characters in a novel, because the character, although it's true that the characters have their being, so the characters have their own kind of world, you know, they wouldn't exist. Not just they wouldn't exist, but their narrative, their stories wouldn't exist without the author. I don't want to use the word manufacture, but like the author contriving in a good sense of contriving, you know, like making, composing, you know, the author contriving and composing their narratives. And I think that, yeah, as long as the narrative is a universalist one, I think there's no problem with viewing God as, you know, contriving in some senses, a predetermined conclusion. Yeah.
So could it maybe be that, like, while there are evil events that occur, and God is the author of all that occurs, there is retribution for those evils that happen within nature and within moral evil doings, such that, like, because of this glorifying overall end that takes place, those what seem to be evils at the forefront are recognized to have some sort of ultimate good behind them, such that it sort of gets God off the hook, basically, for allowing them to occur.
No, yes and no. This will usually be my answer for a lot of things. Yes and no. like a good Anglican. Often Anglicans say yes and no at the same time. I'm not an Anglican though, but the reason why I say yes and no is because in one sense is God is ultimately responsible in a logical sense of everything, you know. And so this is why Dave Benihart actually provocatively speaks of God judging himself at the end, you know, at the end of all things. Is how he speaks in his book, That All Should Be Saved. But in another sense, if God is quote unquote responsible, he's not responsible for the same reasons that we are responsible for our actions, because he's not an agent in the same sense we are, right? So that's why I would also ultimately want to, like, I would want to deny at the same time that God is responsible for evil. So I don't know. My position might sound contradictory, but I just find it difficult to articulate.
Well, here's the question then. Yeah. Like, do you think that your understanding is compatible with determinism, as I sort of laid it out, where you have B necessarily following from A, that sort of system of events that takes place? And you can say you don't know. Like, that's perfectly fine. Like, we're all in a sort of state of growing awareness and curiosity and trying to learn and develop. So I don't want to put you on the spot or anything.
No, I'm just trying to think about, because like, if your concern is with the principle of alternative possibilities, you still want to maintain that principle, right? You want to say that
At least on some instances, I could have done otherwise, given the same antecedent conditions.
Yeah, that an act cannot be truly chosen from among alternatives if there's one physically possible future.
At least not freely.
Agree.
Like I could have chosen in a sort of deterministic sense if like that was the only thing that my character allowed for, but that would be like a choice that I made, but it wouldn't be a free choice according to my sort of understanding of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like hold to like a strong determinism. What was that the word you used at the beginning? Strong determinism or strong compatibilism?
So yeah, there's the hard incompatibilism, which is basically
hard.
Yeah, it's fine. And like, I mean, I don't know. I'm just like, determinism is a sort of like neutral, I guess, position that could be had by somebody that thinks we have moral responsibility. Could also be had by somebody that thinks we don't have moral responsibility.
Yeah.
All of that, or somebody that thinks determinism is false. I guess that would be a rejection, though. Sorry, so that wouldn't quite fit. So anyway, I just want to get a better understanding of like what your position is with regards to determinism as a philosophical position.
Not sure what else to say other than what I've already said about like I think that there's some accounts of determinism that are good if they are classical theist ones, which result in the ultimate triumph of the good, or should be saved. But this is not a determinism that is against like libertarian, what you understand to be libertarianism. So in some ways I'm trying to purposely defy the dichotomy that you're presuming between compatibilism and between compatibilism and libertarianism, because I agree with you that the principle of alternative possibilities is important. It's important to have deliberative freedom, to the ability to do otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But I just don't think this is the whole. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition, to use analytic terms, right? Yeah, so I'm not sure where I'm disagreeing with you, unless you thought probably the disagreement might arise if you thought that in order to be free, we must have the ability to choose otherwise than God, ultimately.
Yeah, so I don't think that's really a necessary position for a libertarian. Like I definitely agree that like in God we are most ultimately free, even if we can only perform the good.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like taking from Augustine that like when we do evil, we're inhibiting ourselves, because like when we choose to do evil, we become enslaved to evil to the point that we can no longer do anything else besides that evil. We become habitually sort of accustomed to what is bad. But it's only through God coming down and saving us out of that by taking on human flesh and sort of healing the human soul, the human nature even, that we can be renewed, restored, so that we are free in the most ultimate sense, where we do only ever choose the good. But I think that only ever choosing the good is compatible with libertarianism insofar as we recognize there are multiple goods that could be chosen from. And I think like God being a omnipotent creator where he could have chosen some other world besides this one is definitely good, and God can only choose the good. That would mean that God is libertarian free in a sense, even though he can't choose to do evil.
Can I jump in real quick? This is something that I was wanting to bring up, actually. The point that you were making, John, about God needs to come down and assume our human condition and ultimately die and then be raised, and then there's some sort of liberation that happens, right? You were talking about healing, but
Mm-hmm.
the truth in the Son, as John 8 would say, right, sets you free,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what does that setting free have to do with your account of libertarian freedom? Because the way that you were just talking about it was you have this sort of libertarian freedom to choose God or to choose evil, but ultimately God does need to set you free to get to that ultimate sort of responding to the ultimate good, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious how the sort of deliberative move that, you know, I'm just a good Bible believing Protestant that the scriptures talk about. So yeah, how does that sort of fit in?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I'd reject Pelagianism if it's like Pelagianism is the position
That's
that
good.
like we can choose God without Christ becoming incarnate and healing us from the human condition. So, like, yeah, like even if I'm totally depraved and I can only choose the evil, maybe it's because there's multiple evils in front of me that I can choose between. So, like, yeah, I don't think that like libertarianism commits me to any sort of like I think it comes in conflict with like Calvinist understandings, like God's eternal decree for one specific outcome to ultimately occur. But I don't know if it like comes in conflict at all with the Christian story about like God becoming incarnate to bring us up out of the place that we previously were. And because like even as a libertarian, if some option is sort of cut off from you, say through original sin or something like that, that's just another option that you don't have. And so like it's not the case that like if you're a libertarian that you're committed to the position that any possible ability you have to your avail, like to your avail. It can be the case that like what normal like certain circumstances would have allowed you to choose the good. Say if like Adam and Eve had never sinned, we would still be able to choose to love God wholly and fully for all of eternity without in contrast, I guess, to the state that we're in with original sin and all of that. If that's your understanding of original sin, if not, then ignore that, I guess. So yeah, as a libertarian, I don't think like you have to say that you can choose God or evil, because like I think even in heaven, when we don't have the ability to choose sin, we're still going to be libertarian free in the same sense that, not the exact same sense, Sam, as God is libertarianly free in being able to bring about multiple different types of worlds.
Mm.
Yeah. So what I'm still a little bit, I'm struggling to grasp a bit is there and maybe I can put it in this kind of dumb way, is there a difference, because that's just how I talk, is there a difference between the freedom that you were describing kind of prior, quote unquote, prior to Christ's deliverance of us and Christ setting us free and healing us? Is there a difference between what people are experiencing prior to that and after that? Or are they they're the same thing, in what way are they the same thing?
Yeah. And that's a good point. Like, I think there's this sort of connotation to freedom that it always has this sort of positive aspect to it. Like, being free is a good thing. So like, the only sense of freedom is in this sort of like qualitatively set sort of standard. But I think you can talk about freedom in a sort of like neutral sort of sense, where the ability to do otherwise, where like you can say the devil is free in a sort of ability to do otherwise sense, even though he's like still estranged from God and like deeply connected to sin and all of that. I don't know. I never really thought about whether God, I guess, yeah, I'd want to say that the devil is libertarianly free because he chose to reject God. I wouldn't want to say that God like instilled that into his nature so that he would necessarily reject God. So yeah, I guess even in a sense, the devil, at least in that moment of time prior to his fall, was libertarian free. Maybe he was that one choice sort of committed him in a sort of strict outflow from that. I think that's sort of like Aquinas's position on the angels, is that like they get one sort of decision and then that sets their character or essence in stone. Anyway, so the question was like whether we are free in a prior sense, and then Christ comes down, incarnate, crucified, made as a sacrifice. Whether that sort of changes the human spirit. And I'd say, yeah, definitely for those that believe, repent, and are baptized and brought into the body of Christ, they are restored in the sense that they will no longer be as shackled to sin. So like where maybe they were libertarian free in a quasi sort of sense of like they can choose to do good things on occasions, they don't have the sort of supernatural grace that God gives them to be able to love even their enemies. Perhaps I think that's what's recognized as a sort of supernatural charity that through Christ that we're able to now have that sort of charity towards others, whereas previously we would have only had a sort of like altruistic or maybe like not altruistic, but a sort of selfish interest only for ourselves and our kin. Whereas, through Christ, we're an expanded sort of sense of freedom so that we can now do things that previously were unavailable to us, given our sort of estrangement from God and also enshacklement to sin and death. Okay.
Right. So, so you would obviously hold to the Thomistic understanding that the line of how grace does not nullify nature but fulfills it and perfects it,
Perfects what?
How grace does not nullify nature but perfects and presupposes it.
Yeah, because like Adam and Eve, they were of a human nature in a sort of glory-filled state, but through sin they
I mean, this is of course where I would differ between you two classical theists in terms of the grace perfecting. And Samuel and I have talked about this a bit. I just come at this stuff a bit differently, obviously. And I think for me, theologically, the way that I am really only comfortable talking about freedom is the freedom that I was quoting from John 8, which is being set free by the Son, by the truth. And then you're made free to respond to in full autonomy and freedom as God has created you to be, ultimately. God sets you free to be free in response to God, right? Samuel kind of was referring to Shavara's gripes about Karl Barth, but I think Barth actually has a beautiful account of correspondence here, where we're set free by Jesus to respond, and there's a responsibility that goes along with that, and a vocation that goes along with that. So 3-4 of the dogmatics is pretty much all about this sort of responsibility that humans have as free corresponding agents to the God who is free and sets them free, right? So it's in that kind of theological situation that I'm really only concerned about talking about freedom. The sort of stuff that happens in our enslaved fleshly condition, that's just not freedom. I think in a theological, that's enslavement. That's exactly the opposite of freedom. That's being constrained, right? So does that make sense? Kind of what that sort of zone of God setting you free is where that's really what I'm concerned about with freedom.
I can definitely see that as like when we recognize freedom as a type of good for human beings that we like seek after and desire. The way that the principle of alternative possibilities is a very sort of like monotone, analytic, basically like neutral.
And like I agree with it in a basic sense. Like, of course, I think we can choose otherwise, right? I just wouldn't talk about that as what. In the theological
like the ability to do otherwise is not like a sort of desirable sort of fact about it. Like if you're only inclined towards the good, such that you're like always becoming closer and closer to Christ and becoming more and more like Christ in every day after that, even in a deterministic sense, that seems like, well, that I like that. I want to go for that. I don't know if I don't know if the libertarian sense of freedom is a necessary good. Like I know that some sort of like apologetic, like the free will defense sort of like requires that libertarian freedom is this sort of like ultimate good that God could only create creatures like that.
You don't agree with that?
Yeah, I don't think so. Because like I see, like I can imagine a world in which like only angels exist, maybe, and maybe those angels only can worship God or something like that. That seems like a reasonable enough world for God to create. Now, I still think that, like human beings, we are libertarian free, at least in some of our actions. Sometimes we'll be like, due to original sin, we have like this sort of predisposition towards what's bad for us that we're not responsible for in a strong sense, or culpable for in the sort of sense that a true sense of freedom, that like somebody like Adam or Eve were culpable for their actions. Because anyway, yeah, that sort of a few thoughts there.
Yeah. I guess with this whole notion of like personal responsibility, and I actually agree with what John just said about like Bart's account. I like that account of responsibility and all that sort of thing. I think that as long as you this word responsibility, as long as you emphasize the etymological sense of responsibility, which means literally the ability to respond, that's what the word means, right? You know, and as long as you acknowledge that we, and often in our lives, we begin with our ability to respond to the call of the good is often much more limited, constricted, constrained. Our vision's not as broadened, as it should be, so that we can fulfill our natures and, realize our potentials to become God ultimately. I think that notion of responsibility is fine. My problem is just like when responsibility is individualistic, so individualistic, just concerned with like what people usually think of like responsibility, personal responsibility.
The fact that like somebody is a rapist, sure, they are responsible for that action, but there's still a sort of responsibility that the community has as well, that they're not like taking care of those types of people so that they're able, these sorts of events don't happen. Like if you have somebody that's like inclined towards molesting children or something like that, there's a responsibility that the community has to sort of prevent that from happening. And that's a sense in which having this sort of like I don't know if this is exactly related to libertarian freedom, but at least a sort of like a political sort of libertine sense, where you have this sort of like individual pockets of people without this sort of collective responsibility of the community over them. That's politically a problem, but that's probably a different sort of topic of discussion.
No, and I think we both agree with you that it is a political problem. I think you're totally right about the sort of interconnected responsibilities that go on. It's a sort of social thing. We're not talking about discrete individuals that are just responsible in and of themselves. It's really never the case. We're all always.
It's a very modern sort of notion that the ancient sort of
absolutely
peoples didn't really have there.
Absolutely. No, yeah, absolutely. I want to move us to something that has been alluded to a few times, which is something that always comes up on my streams, is the issue of hell and universalism, that sort of stuff. You were kind of nudging in that direction a few times, both of you were. So let's kind of talk about that. And I'm not really sure how to start this other than there's been a lot of agreement happening when you've been talking about freedom of the will. And so what I know that you guys end up diverging, I guess, once you get to this question of
fair enough,
of hell and really eschatology, right? So I'm curious to kind of tease out where those differences are. So how does libertarian free will for you, John? What's its role in the final destinations of human beings? It's sort of eternally. How would you see that fitting in?
If I was a theological determinist, I'd probably be a universalist as well, because I think that any sort of understanding of double predestination is morally reprehensible, even if God is like not a sort of moral agent in the same sort of sense that you and I are. it's still like I have a clear enough understanding of like what's right and wrong to know that if God like decreed for people to be eternally punished in hell forever, through no contribution of their own will or like decisions that they made. Rather, it's like independent of that, God did like decree this to take place. Then yeah, I definitely like reject that sort of under that strong Calvinist understanding. And maybe that's you guys hold to unlimited atonement, but also still the sort of what's the term? It's the elect, I guess, for everyone. So in regards to libertarian freedom and hell, it's a sticking point, but I'll try to defend the Catholic traditional Catholic position. There is still discussion within the church over whether we can hope that all shall be saved in the end. And was it Balthazar? He has the article of like, dare we hope that all shall be saved, or dare we hope that hell is empty, or something like that. And that's a position that's within discussion, I think, within the church. Now, I myself, I'm sort of in a position where like I'm a new Catholic, and so I sort of want to try to be committed to the traditional Catholic positions prior to adding my own contributions and like diverging from the tradition at all. And so I'll go ahead and try to defend the sort of strong sense of hell that, there are people that will choose to reject God and become enslaved to sin for eternity. Now, I want to sort of like, I guess, lessen that somewhat in saying that like to be existing in eternity separated from God is not an ultimate evil such that it would be better for God to annihilate those beings. And so this is where I think I'll probably have to diverge somewhat from the tradition at least, and it's saying that there's a sense in which it is good that the damned are in hell. And I know like everybody's like alarms are like going off. What the hell is he talking about? And I think that like anyone that like holds to the convertibility principle that like to be is to have some sort of good in a sense. And so that's a sense in which like, okay, how are we supposed to understand separation from God through our choices if in conjunction with that convertibility principle? So like that means that there's at least some good to be had even in hell. And maybe the good that can be had is a hope that eventually God will release them so that they could undergo sanctification to the point that they could be brought into heaven. That's a hope that we can have. And it's funny, even Thomas Aquinas. So I was like on a lark, I read through Thomas Aquinas's strong defenses of hell in the sort of eternal sense and all of that. But yet there's still a passage where he talks about whether it's appropriate to pray for the damned. And he said, no, it's not appropriate to pray that the damned will repent because they have sort of enslaved them, or they have set their decision in stone to the point that they're unable to repent. But we can still pray that God would free them from that so that they can repent. And that seems like a sense in which, if you hold to God's being omnipotent, there's at least the possibility that God can free those from hell by giving them another opportunity to repent for their sins. Because I think that's probably the difference. Is like, if we are unrepentant of our sins, then being in close proximity, I'm using that in an analogical sense, to the ultimate good is going to be tormenting to us. And so there's a sense in which God is merciful that he allows those that are unrepentant to be away from God in a sort of sense. So like this is drawing from C.S. Lewis, where God sort of sets up the desolate wasteland where people that are unrepentant for their sins can be away from the ultimate good. And that's where like C.S. Lewis says the gates of hell are locked from the inside. Now, even then, that's not going to get over everything, but that's at least my sort of laying it quite a bit out here. So I'm open for criticism.
Yeah, Samuel, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I somewhat sympathize with your position because I used to hold for a little while that C.S. Lewis's defense of hell was, the best and most coherent account. But ultimately, I don't think that, firstly, it is actually adequately addresses the biblical data, which views hell as, in some senses, directly caused by God. But more importantly for me, philosophically and theologically, secondly, I think that this view of hell as like kind of egocentric self-isolation, you sort of I mean, you spoke it quite a few times in what you last said about how we are separated from God, and we're separated from God. But being classical theists, you wouldn't want to say that because God is omnipresent, that God is actually separate. It's just we perceive God to be separated from us because of our decisions, right? Yeah, so that's like the initial worry I have with just the language of the free will defense of hell, is that it like biblically and theologically it is a bit problematic. But one other thing I'll just quickly say is that I don't now. So you might think that the typically Calvinist view, where God has a double predestination, some people predestined to heaven, other people determined to hell. You might think that that's problematic, and I agree with you. It is very problematic. But I don't think that by going from saying that God is directly responsible for the fate of the damned to going to saying that God is indirectly responsible for the fate of the damned, like it doesn't change the problem of God still being ultimately responsible for people eternally being damned. So that's my main issue with the traditionally Catholic view of hell, is that and I think that this paradox that you find in Aquinas, which you've just articulated, you're talking about Aquinas, how there seems like this contradiction. I think it's actually a contradiction. I don't think it's just a nice paradox, which I think it's a deep contradiction to say that that somehow we are at one and the same time. It's a contradiction to say at one and the same time that the damned are free to choose their destiny, yet also to say that we should pray, that God might, save them. I think that, I don't think this makes any sense theologically. I don't think, I mean, you might want to, I don't know, fall back into the language of probability. You might want to say that it's, I don't know, improbable, not necessarily certain. Yeah, it's improbable that other people, God will, that everyone will be saved in the end, but you don't want to eliminate the possibility that God, people, hell could eventually be empty in the end. That might be your position, but yeah, I still have a deep problem both the on the end of God, but also on the end of humans. So on the end of God, the problem is, in a nutshell, that God is indirectly causing an irredeemable evil. which is people, people who are eternally damned, their evil, unlike many evils within this finite world, cannot be redeemed. There's an irrevocability to that, that state. So that's the problem with God, even indirectly causing this state of irredeemable evils. Right? That's the theological problem. Now, on the end of humans, the problem is just like, it's related to it. They're not separate problems, but the problem with humans is just that you need to provide a plausible account of humans being sufficiently free to choose otherwise than God, essentially. And I don't think that account is, I don't think you can provide a plausible account, because if it's the case, as Augustine says, that God is not just superior sumo meo, higher than my highest, but also interior intimo meo, more inward than my most inmost, then God is not a choice to, of our, God is not a choice in the same way that other things are choices in our lives. And so God here would have to be, and I think you agree with this, God is freely, God is choosing us to freely choose, causing us to freely choose. There's that primary causality, whatever, causing us to exist, to remain in existence. And in the so in the case of the damned, you might want to say that that there's still some goods, because it's good to exist. It's good for them to exist, which I don't disagree with. I actually I don't take the annihilationist. I don't think it's better to be annihilated than to exist. Like I agree with. I agree with the Catholic position on this issue. But the problem I have is just that there's still this is ultimately the issue. There's an arbitrariness to God cutting off sanctifying grace in the traditional Catholic view. Why does God have to create a world where it's possible, even actual, that some might be eternally damned? Like, this is, because you're libertarian, you say that God chose, libertarianly, he chose to create a world where it's, where some people are eternally damned.
Yeah.
Now, but wait, why?
Like, it would be better if God instead created a world in which there wasn't that possibility for an irredeemable evil to take place. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Yes. That's what I'm asking you. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, in trying to figure out what sort of sense of good would it be for even the damned to exist, and I think that it's a sort of, I guess, fact that, like, taking from Scripture, there is the unforgivable sin that, at least within the Catholic view, is understood to be unrepentance. That, like, if we're unrepentant for our sins, there's no way in which God can sort of, like, bring us out of that, because, like, to be repentant is a sort of action of the will that requires our performing, in a sort of sense. That, like, now, I don't know, maybe this is where we're going to get into further troubles of, but yeah, I don't. So yeah, for the damned to exist in an unrepentant state, like, God would have to, I think, give them the means in which to hide away from him, because there's this fact that is a sort of phenomenological fact I recognize, at least within myself, maybe, that, like, when I am in the presence of someone much greater than myself, and I'm not looking towards them to become like them, I become, like, in a more miserable sort of state. And so that's a sense in which, like, maybe it would be more merciful for God to allow the unrepentant to have a sort of isolation from himself. Now, it's still going to be the case that God is causing them to exist, but he's not causing them to exist with a full presence with his glory. They're not in the beatific vision, because for them to be in that sort of beatific vision while they are unrepentant would be more horrible than for them to be isolated from the beatific vision while unrepentant. So that's okay. And then the question was like, okay, why would God allow for this type of world in which that sort of events can take place rather than a world in which, like, that angel world or something like that, or like I have this example of a gecko world where only geckos exist, because I think that would be kind of neat. So why not? Why would he even allow for this sort of world to take place? And I think it's because it offers us the ability to contribute towards the embetterment of the world, where, like, giving creatures the ability to bring about the goods of the world is a good thing for God to do. And so that would give him a reason to allow creatures to exist, cause creatures to exist, and even allow them to perform evils towards each other's, whether natural or moral evils towards one another. So, okay, yeah, there's a few things there, but I am curious though, like, what are your thoughts though on that sort of, like, it's almost more merciful for God to allow the unrepentant to be isolated from himself, not being able to experience God in his full glory, because if he did allow them to experience that sort of state, that would be worse than to be in hell for them in a phenomenological sense, because being unrepentant in the presence of, like, ultimate goodness would just ultimately demoralize you.
I don't disagree with that at all in principle. But you still haven't quite addressed the question I had, which is about why does God need to create a world where this providential self-isolation is eternal, irrevocable. So what I'm asking, conversely, is, like, why can't it be that God definitely does. I think it's better for God to permit people to be self-determining, to, if they resist the good, in some senses they have isolated themselves. In some sense, not completely, they have isolated themselves from the, but why make it so that it's not possible for everyone to attain the beatific vision? That's the question I'm asking. It's like, why can't everyone attain the beatific vision? I mean, apart from, without appealing to just, I don't want to sound rude, but without just appealing to Catholic dogma. I mean, like, philosophically.
So I think
why can't everyone attain it?
It's going to have to have been possible, because I affirm a principle of alternative possibilities, that the possibility to attain the beatific vision was within the agent themselves. But all they needed to do was repent, accept Christ as their Savior, and then be restored so that they could achieve that, and be baptized and restored so that they could achieve that beatific vision. And so that's a sense in which it is a real possibility. When God creates the world, for every creature to be in that perfect bliss with God, but some of those creatures choose to remain unrepentant of their sins, and that's on them. It's like there's, like, either God could cause them to cease to exist, which we recognize would be contrary to God as the good, perhaps, or God could, like, still give them that sort of beatific vision, to allow them to be in the presence of himself in that sort of full unhindered glory, which you seem to agree to, like, maybe would be bad for them. All right, but sorry, John wanted to
Can I press into this a little bit more? Sorry, Samuel. And
Yeah.
this may complement what you're about to say, but I want to clarify something.
Yeah.
Samuel and I believe in hell.
Yeah.
That's not what's at issue, right?
Right.
The thing that I think needs to be addressed that I'm not really hearing clearly is why is it eternal? Why is this hell that we're talking about, which all of us believe in different ways? Why is it eternal? Why is there no? Why is it an end in itself? I guess. Although that's you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Of course, using
And
eternal
also,
in that is
Sorry, just before you respond, could I just add one like sort of clarifying question to respond to more directly to what you just last said, John? Is so I can put it another way. So like, why can't everyone undergo some kind of purgatory? In other words, because I think your problem is your issue earlier. You seem to suggest that it's either someone immediately attains the beatific vision, or is or not necessarily immediately, but like they are predestined.
I get what you're
to attain
saying.
the beatific vision, or they're not predestined to attain the beatific vision. Or permissively, not whatever however you want to put it. But why can't it be like progressive? Progressively, God
cleanses them of their sins through fire.
Yeah, purges people from their sins, so that ultimately everyone is saved. Yeah, that's what I'm asking, really.
Yeah, and I think that our retaining our unrepentance, it's a sort of weird way to phrase it, is what sort of prevents that from taking place. That if it is the case that we do repent from our sins, and here's where I think that like I'll maybe want to somewhat go against Catholic teaching. Or, I mean, I don't want to go too far, but I think that it's a reasonable
Be careful about that.
hope. It's a reasonable position to think that God gives all the opportunity to know him fully, even post-mortem, like a post-mortem experience of who he is, the opportunity to accept him as their Lord and Savior, and then leaving it up to them to whether they fall at their knees or whether they retain in their sort of retain their unrepentant state. And here's where I'll push on you guys a little bit. You guys, I'm sure, affirm Scripture as divine revelation. How do you understand the unforgivable sin that Jesus refers to? Because within Catholic teaching, it's on the understanding of unrepentance. But curious what your guys' thoughts are. Because if there is a type of unforgivable sin, would that be something that prevents people from undergoing a sort of purging of their sins to reach that beatific vision in heaven?
You may have opened up a whole other can of worms.
Is unrepentance the unforgivable sin?
I think that's the Catholic teaching. I have to like check the catechism.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up Scripture being divine revelation.
That's the kind of worms
as Samuel would say, yes and no. It's more complicated than that, I think, from where I'm coming from. So I'm not.
Yeah.
I am a Protestant, but I'm not in the sort of camp that has Scripture elevated in this particularly Jesus-like status, if I could put it that way. So that opens up a lot of hermeneutical and exegetical possibilities, I think, that could be interesting to talk through, but that takes you, of course, into a very different direction. But
and I'll admit here that like I'm not fully satisfied by this. I'm sure.
I can kind of tell.
Shouldn't be.
I'm doing my best here. Yeah, exactly. And there is a point that I'll have to actually like really think whether I'm contradicting myself here somewhat in saying that like in order to repent from our sins, we sort of require God to come down to save us from this sort of state. And whether, even after death, if you're unrepentant, God can't save you from there. It's like, it seems like there's a bit of a contradiction here somewhere.
No, it is.
So, that's definitely something I'll have to try to be more, really consider strongly. because it may be that is an explicit contradiction within my position.
Yeah, and I think the sort of, because there are of course universalist approaches that sort of deny the existence of hell in any sort of way, right? I don't like that stuff either.
Yeah.
I know Samuel doesn't like certain other approaches to sort of universalism either, because I think what it does is it gives you the account of, and I think an even stronger account of judgment and in the fires of hell than a sort of fundamentally retributive account of punishment and hell and sort of hell is eternal give you, because the judgment and the hell in my understanding is
like
corrective. It's corrective.
Yeah.
It's getting you somewhere else. It's not an end in itself, right? So the judgment is even more powerful because it's actually doing something to you that gets you to a place where you are restored. I mean, I don't, just to sort of think in terms of modern justice, right? I think a lot of us are becoming well aware that like restorative approaches to justice are much more healing and life-giving and beautiful, right? Things when we see them happening, especially to do with our criminal justice system, right? Which is very harsh and very sort of punitive, right? And I think, I'm just more attracted to that sort of account of justice. I'm not quite sure how to articulate that other than that. That just seems like much more of a powerful account of justice. If God is actually, if there is a telos to that, and it's not just eternal torment.
So I guess,
torture, or however you would want to talk about it in terms of eternity. But
I guess I'm committed to then the position that we have to be cooperative with God's grace, rather than God's grace being sort of like totally efficacious, independent. Like we could be kicking and screaming and God pulls us through purgatory. I think that like purgatory is going to be a type of place where we have to, well, the reason that we can go through purgatory is because we have God as our ultimate end and we are wanting to cooperate with God. Whereas if we were taken to the afterlife and we don't want God as our ultimate end, then it seems like I don't see how we could progress through purgatory at all, to the point that it might be that like Satan, we just sort of like egoistically turn inwards and retain that sort of smaller good. It's not the ultimate good, but it's a sort of like turning towards ourselves as a good, as if we were the summum bonum, when in fact we are not.
I think the issue though is that if there is that point where we're not choosing God as the good and we're still choosing other things as replacements for God as the good, we're not there yet. we're not quite along the sort of as Samuel was talking about it, the sort of this more kind of progressive account of purgation, right? So when you're talking about somebody rejecting God, we're just not to the point. We're not quite far enough along the story, right? We're not far enough along that progression, right?
Right.
So I don't know why we would. I still just don't know the need to talk about rejection of God as an end. I just don't. I'm just still very unclear about that.
So I think, go ahead, Samuel.
So just one other thing, I just want to make sure that I'm sort of directly addressing what your concerns are, John. Rather than going on off different tangents. Not that John was doing that necessarily, but you seem to like, I don't know, but earlier you seemed to suggest like a picture where like either people submit to God willingly or they don't submit to God willingly. I think it's just too simple of a too simplistic dualistic picture of the world. I mean, if someone finds themselves in a position where they are more likely to submit to the call of the good, that is because they had not just opportunities to respond to the call of the good, but also because they've actually become free from enslavement to sin, right? Whereas if you're, on the other hand, if you find yourself more in the position of of rejecting not submitting to God, you need to ask, why is it the case that someone rejects God at time t? Because the answer will have to be because they've mistaken a relative good for being the absolute good. That's usually the case. That's just phenomenologically, that's the case. But if someone's mistaken a relative good for being the absolute good, then and then they are necessarily in bondage.
They'd be ignorant.
An idol.
And then that would be
right. And
if they're ignorant
they don't
of something, then they're not.
They don't
acting,
fully know the good at that point.
They don't fully know the good. Or at least they don't know the good as much as someone who's more sanctified would know the good.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Right. And so if they, so the question is just like, if they don't know the good as much as someone who does know the good, and someone who's in heaven, or at least on the way to heaven, then how can you say that that person who rejects submitting to God at, I don't know, time t, say that's the end of their life, whatever. How can you say that their decision to not choose God is actually free? So that's their freedom would have to be qualified and limited, and ultimately relative. Like, you can't. Yeah, that's the issue I just have. Is it's you have to say, this is the contradiction in your view. You have to say, on the one hand, that they so on your Catholic Thomistic view, you have to say that they, in rejecting God, they are actually choosing the good. This idea of the guise of the good. So it means, like, even if you do choose something that's evil or whatever, you're actually you're choosing it as if it's good for you. So you ultimately still under the good in that sense, under the aspect of the good. But how can it be that someone on the one hand rejects God like absolutely, while actually, I don't know how to articulate this. How can it be that God, it's just a paradox of, like, someone.
Yeah, I definitely
supposedly. Let me try.
No, go ahead.
It's a paradox of, like, someone. It's basically a certain delusion that someone has, that they delusively believe that they are absolutely rejecting God and choosing the good, for them. But this is not actually absolute; it's relative. Like, it has to be relative.
Necessarily.
I mean, it's not absolute. It's just not possible to absolutely reject the good in life. You can't absolutely reject the good. Like, it's the good in itself cannot be rejected. The good in its manifestations, in its finite manifestations to us, can be rejected finitely, limitedly. That's possible, obviously, but you can't actually, like, metaphysically, it's not possible for you to absolutely reject the good in itself. And so, if it's not possible, then what is your view? I mean, like, how does your view make sense?
Yeah, so I think part of this
that was a very kind way of saying, what are you talking about, John?
So there's a sense in which it seems like this is sort of assuming the Platonic understanding of evil, where, like, all evil actions are,
which is the Catholic view,
done out of ignorance. And I don't know if, like, I don't know if I should accept that, because, like, Adam and Eve, in disobeying God, I mean, sure, they weren't aware of certain, like, future events that were going to take place, but it still seems like if they're responsible for their actions, then they were acting in a stronger sense than if they were ignorant. Like, if you're a moral agent, then the fact that you do something wrong is not going to be just sort of dismissed by the fact that, well, you didn't know that was the right thing to do. Because, like, no, when you're doing something wrong, you do it with an acknowledging that this is not something I should be doing, and yet I'm going to do it anyway. And so it's sort of like Augustine in talking about stealing something, that like anytime we do something wrong, we're doing it with a sort of belief that this thing is good still. And in fact, there is going to be some sort of desirability to whatever we choose.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have chosen it. And so I think what that sort of contradiction of the unrepentant rejecting the summum bonum is going to be a recognition that the unrepentant has in the good of themselves. The fact that they exist is itself a good thing, and a complete directedness towards themselves as their end, which is a good. It's still a good thing that they exist. And it's so that would be them sort of choosing a good that is not the summum bonum, but it is still derivative of the summum bonum. And for that reason, they sort of, I don't know, I just draw the, I guess, analogy to Satan, like when in the presence of God, falling from that because of sort of egoistic turning inwards, where idolizing themselves as the summum bonum or the ultimate good. And that's a sense in which, like, that's not, like, I think in order for us to go through purgatory, we have to be I guess I brought this up already, that like God isn't going to force us through purgatory. Yeah, I think that's the position that I'm staking my claim on.
Well, I mean, I agree with that. I don't disagree that. I don't know what I'm trying to. It's hard to, because I'm just trying to go back to that thing you said about Adam and Eve.
Right, acting out of ignorance. Yeah.
Yeah, but they may know that what they did was evil, but their knowledge would still be limited and relative to their knowledge. I mean, to what they like. Their knowledge at the time is always like, so the fact that their knowledge is relative and qualified, at the time, it qualifies their culpability or their responsibility, right? And so the fact that at every moment in our lives, our ignorance, our finite ignorance of the good is qualified, means that it's not possible for us to
reject the summum bonum,
to unqualifiedly reject the summum bonum.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What I just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think then is that ultimately going to boil down to there's never any instances of people actively doing what they know to be wrong. I mean, you could say that they do so, but only out of ignorance, and so they're not responsible for it. It's rather the fact that they just didn't.
Well, they're not
external.
I think this is a bit of a quick question. So, like, we want to say that they are ignorant in some sense, but also they have knowledge in another sense. They're not completely ignorant, obviously. They have some knowledge.
Right.
But the point is, their knowledge is, the fact that their ignorance is...
The distinction between performing a bad action versus performing a wrong action is the fact that you recognize that the action you're doing, it will lead to a bad result or lead to a wrong... the fact that you do something that has a bad result. I don't know if it's necessarily moral, but let's say a very bad result. And so, like, that's the reason we don't hold like chimps or dogs accountable for their actions, is because they do something, but they're ignorant of the fact that like what they poking out somebody's eye is a bad thing for that chimpanzee to do. But like if I poke your eye out, that is not due to some ignorance I have. It's going to be due to some sort of, oh, I'm going to receive some amount of pleasure for poking you in the eye. And so I'm choosing that lesser good than the greater good of you having your eyes unblemished and mine not poking my finger in it. So that's the thing. It's like whenever there's a sort of evil action that takes place, there's a choosing of a good, but it's a lesser good than any other. And so when the unrepentant chooses to remain unrepentant and not undergo purgatory, then that's them choosing a lesser good, and God retains them in existence despite the fact that they've chosen this lesser good.
Okay, so the question I have now is just, if the damned are perpetually choosing a lesser good in place of the summum bonum, so if, in other words, they are, somehow perpetually mistaking, I mean, to use language of like Romans 1, they are mistaking the creature for a creator. They are, in some sense, creating an idol, of God in a sense, right? Which is their self, right? Then how can, why someone who is, I don't know, I have lots of questions just based on this, but I'm trying to think of one. So, like, why should we believe that it's possible for someone to perpetually mistake God for like some limited creaturely kind of good, so like
why is it possible for a creature to worship themselves rather than God?
Not limitedly, but unlimitedly, unqualifiedly. Like, we have no experience of this. Like, we don't observe this happening in our world.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we observe people rejecting God in a limited way, obviously, all the time. But we have no observation. We don't see people because we live in a limited, finite world, obviously. So we don't see people unlimitedly rejecting God. So why should we believe that it's possible for people to unlimitedly reject God?
I think it's, well, if we think that Satan is somebody that rejected God yet was closest to him up in heaven, then maybe that's a sense in which we're somewhat committed to the position. But again, that's maybe you guys aren't really committed to that position at all. I guess, I mean, it would be the same answer for like, why is it that evil can take place at all? It's because moral evil can take place at all is because creatures choose what is not the ultimate good, and they do so knowingly of what the greater good would be, and yet choose otherwise.
Yeah, I think the issue is the eternity stuff, though, right? Like, because how can somebody choose finite and contingent goods for eternity? How does that make any sense at all? Because that's the claim, is that at least that's what's sort of implied by the claim, that you can consistently turn away from God, and that's what's sort of keeping you, I'm assuming, keeping you in hell for eternity, right? But you're rejecting something finite and contingent, or you're replacing God with something finite and contingent, right?
Right.
I'm just not sure how that all works together.
I mean, human psychology is a wild thing.
But are we? Another question. I mean, sorry, related question. Another way to put it is just
sorry
like,
that we're
why
just
believe?
Jumping on you, John.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to like.
I deserve it. Don't worry.
No.
Another way to put this is just like, why believe that we are so corrupt that it's possible for us to unqualifiedly reject the good?
Yeah.
That's the question that you should probably think about. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it would be a matter of corruption, because like if Adam and Eve were in a state of grace, then they didn't have any sort of initial corruption to them that forced them, or that like due to this corruption that they had, that they chose to reject God and fall from grace. Yeah, what was the exact question? It was like, why do I think that we're so corrupt?
Let me just reinstate it. So
Yeah.
if it's the case that it's possible for someone to everlastingly, like irrevocably reject the good, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would seem to imply that there's some kind of inherent corruption in our nature that makes it actualized, that we can actually do that, So what I'm asking is essentially like, why believe this metaphysical possibility we're thinking of, of someone everlasting object? Why believe that it can be an actuality? Why, why believe that it can be actualized in this real world?
Yeah. So the distinction between inanimate objects and animate objects is going to be that their telos, their nature, is going to either be accomplished without their will contributing towards this, or with their will contributing towards it. So like inanimate objects have no will, and so like the fact that a seed will be planted into the earth and grow into the tree is something that is only through external means that this can actually take place. Whereas for animate objects, or maybe more specifically humans who are rational creatures, their telos, I'll agree, the ultimate end of every human creature is to be at one with God, to be unified in theosis for all of eternity. But that's sort of, in order for that telos to take place, is through the contribution of the will of the creature. And so that mere fact that it's through this contribution of the will of the creature entails that the possibility for the possibility for an alternate ultimate end state of that human creature.
Is God a possibility among other possibilities? Isn't he the ground of all possibilities? I mean, yeah. Agree, obviously. Right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I just don't see.
So, like, okay,
any
that's
kind
an
of
interesting sort of argument that, like, anytime we choose a lesser good, because God is even there in the lesser good, we're ultimately still choosing God somewhat, even if it's a sort of ignorant sort of sense of choosing God.
Yeah.
And so,
exactly,
no matter what choice we make, we're still eventually going to pull that thread all the way back to God as our ultimate end. That's an interesting argument. I'll have to think about it further.
I mean, it's kind of what I've been trying to say the whole time, really.
Okay.
Not just what I've just did in the last few seconds.
Yeah.
It wasn't really obvious.
It's just been 2 hours. It's fine.
You have to repeat it a bunch of times in order for it to like break it through here. Okay. Yeah. Thank you though for that.
I mean, I think
it is a good argument.
Yeah. If the end of this is, as I think we all agree, that God will be all in all, right? As we get in 1 Corinthians 15, right? Like that's the end. And I think the universalist position that Samuel has been bringing through quite nicely is the most consistent with that, as was brought up before, that end, that it's the most consistent with what eschatology is sort of pushing into our theological and philosophical thinking. I think that's kind of where we need to go if we want to be really consistent, right? But I do want to see if we have any questions, because we've gone over 2 hours and I am tired.
Thank you guys so much for the conversation. This was two very important topics, and I'm sort of actually glad that we sort of got to touch on both of them, because I know for you guys, universalism is very important to your theology, and so being able to sort of connect those two in a strong sense is really, really helpful, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, sweet. Let's
give me 1 second. I gotta use the restroom.
Craig Reed just showed up 2 hours late.
Let's
see if we have questions.
Do we have any questions?
It's going back to the top. I don't Ethan asked a similar question to what we were talking about later on. He asked it quite early, so he was, I don't know why he's not just doing this instead of us. That's Craig. I know you didn't watch this, Craig. The first 2 hours are pointless. I'm just gonna, what I'm gonna do is edit this down to the last couple minutes that we talked, and just be like, this is it.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we were
That's kind of what I was trying to say.
trying to say. Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't really
Yeah,
have
I
any
think
questions.
there's a misconception a lot of people have regarding Universalists that it's just like, oh, as soon as you're dead, you get off scot-free for all of the ways in which you've built up your character over time. But
Yeah. And what I was trying to say earlier is that it does entail a kind of robust account of judgment.
And purgatory.
In purgatory, which is really, really important.
Yeah.
As you were saying, I would put it a bit differently than you did, but like, I would put it in a more kind of Pauline sense, is that our flesh needs to be burned away before we can be in the presence of God forever, right? That needs to be executed in Christ's execution and dead and buried. And Christ needs to be raised. In him, we're raised beyond the flesh, beyond sin and death, to be with God in perfection and fellowship, right? So yeah, I think that's that's really important. Really important stuff. I don't think we have any questions. Samuel, you look like you want to say something.
No, I just wanted to get John to, if he wanted to say anything else. I mean, I don't want to like put him on the spot, like you have to answer this question now, otherwise you look like an idiot. Or
Are you talking to me or are you talking to John? I always look like an idiot, so it's just not even.
I'll have another opportunity to do that with you, John.
Yeah, you will
Find some other topic to disagree on.
Yeah.
So how would you, like, just for now, like, how would you respond to like what I was trying to say just right at the end before, about how like I was sort of questioning like why if we are choosing the good even while rejecting the good in some moment, whatever, why is it metaphysically possible for us to absolutely reject the good if the
ultimate good? Like, I think in rejecting God, there's a sense in which it's not rejecting the good wholly. It's only accepting God in a limited sense. That like, if I'm turning inwards towards myself, I am, in a sense, I guess, accepting God as the summum bonum, but I'm not accepting God in his completeness. I'm only accepting him in a limited sense. And I think that's maybe the point of contention between us, like whether God can force us to undergo purgatory, whether purgatory requires our active willing for it to continue and to progress, or whether it can be, God can sort of do it independent of our willing for it to progress.
I don't think that's a disagreement.
Okay.
No, I think the disagreement is just is regarding the sense of like, why is it metaphysically possible for humans to not just eternally reject God? Because often people think of eternally just in terms of like finite, discrete moments, like an infinite timeline. It just goes on forever. Not just eternally, but also, this is the key one. Often people miss. Also, irrevocably In other words,
Yeah,
this is there's no second chance. For some people, according to the Catholic view, there's a point where it's cut off. Where they can't attain theosis, essentially. So the question is ultimately why believe that God has cut off theosis for certain people? He's either done that for eternity or he's not. Whether or not you're Calvinist, whether or not it doesn't really matter. He's either, it's either God's eternal will that he's cut off some people from theosis, and they're damned.
Right. So I reject that God cuts people off from theosis and say that people cut themselves off from undergoing a full theosis. So they are willing to accept a minimal theosis of only being in union with the good to the extent that they're in union with themselves and not in union with other people, with the body of saints, with even their enemies and all of these other things. So it wouldn't be God cutting
I agree
them
with
off.
that as well.
It would be them cutting themselves off. Because that's the question, is whether God can force them out of this position, whether God can sort of push them through purgatory against their will. And does that sound like the type of greatest good that would be out there? Well, we might have differences in.
Yeah, I think you're lapsing into this either or of either God's dragging us through or we're choosing it specifically. I don't think we disagree with with saying that our wills are involved in purgatory. I mean,
well, here's one thing.
At least I don't disagree with that.
So I'm trying to make this much more clear and help. So you may say that you believe that God is not cutting off people from theosis, but you may say that. But if you believe, on the other hand, that it's metaphysically possible for someone to everlastingly reject God, then what you say is actually not completely true, because you're saying that God doesn't cut off people from theosis, but
this could be exactly the same way. It's saying God's not the author of evil, because God's not the one that initiates this fact of the matter. It would be the case that the individual themselves that is unrepentant initiates this fact.
No, but he would initiate the everlasting damnation as being a possibility that can be actualized, obviously, because he initiates.
Right. So God gives us a blank page and we write in it. Something like that.
Yeah, so...
Because you agreed, you don't want to say that God is the author of evil. And so you agree that evil does take place.
The problem I have is that if... I can't help seeing God as the author of evil if everlasting damnation was actually actualized. I would. I mean, it's getting slightly more personal, but everything's personal anyway. So, I would be an atheist if everlasting damnation, if God permitted everlasting damnation. I don't want. I wouldn't want to believe in that God.
Yeah, agreed.
Even in the C.S. Lewisian sort of sense, where it's just a sort of emptiness and vastness, where people sort of don't like being around other people.
Yeah, I'll tell you why I would be an atheist. Because ultimately, God fails. God created the world where the ultimate telos of creation is supposed to be that, as Augustine says, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, right? Mm-hmm. That's the ultimate telos or purpose of creation. But if some people don't attain the ultimate telos, then ultimately God is responsible and God fails. He doesn't achieve his end of, everyone achieving, everyone being in union with him. It's just, I don't see how you can deny that God fails. It would be
creature's end. God is self-subsistent and perfectly content
part of the
himself.
issue though is that God would have created a world that is so fragile that human beings can fuck it up, right? So it still ends up going back to God creating things and setting things up in a way that would be,
Yeah.
in some sense, fracturable enough for humans to do. So it's not as simple as saying, "Oh, humans are the ones who actually bring evil in to the cosmos." It's simply on humans. I don't think that actually gets you around the problem that's introduced.
Well,
but
yeah, this is an interesting, like, where theodicy sort of comes in. Of like, if we think that the mere fact that God allows a possibility for evil to take place, like, how does God not evil? And it seems like your
So
sort of position is that because God allows evil so that it can be ultimately fulfilled in the greatest good of the summum bonum.
Well, I mean, that's your position as well, isn't it?
Well, no, I hold to a sort of deontological theodicy where God doesn't allow evils for greater goods that overcompensate it.
Well, I mean, I'm not a utilitarian either. I mean, I know you can make universalists sound like utilitarians if you want, but like, it's not necessarily like, I don't know. It's just really.
That's good.
I don't like pigeonholing people in certain boxes. You know, if they sort of sound like a utilitarian because they're saying that, you know, God creates the world so that you know, we go through evil, the fires of evil and hell, just so that we can attain you know, the final end of union with God. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make someone a utilitarian. Like, I mean, it might sound like that, but
it's still, I don't know, it's still a sense in which God's like trading evils for goods, or using evils for goods, and which seems still like to tarnish God's ultimate ends somehow.
But isn't that also what's happening on your view? Isn't God using?
Like I said, so I'm developing a sort of somewhat deontological theodicy where God has good reasons for allowing evils to take place, that even if those evils don't contribute at all towards some greater good down the line, but God will still, what's the term? God will still compensate the creatures that undergo these sort of natural evils or moral evils as victims, so that they'll at least be able to accept the fact that they went through that sort of process. But that's not saying that like God allows this event to take place so that this greater event can take place after that. I think that, like, I know this might put me off from a lot of perfect being theists, that there is a sense in which gratuitous evil takes place if what we mean by gratuitous evil is events that do not contribute at all towards some greater good down the line. Like, I think that the greater good is prior to that, in that, well, my basic theodicy is that God allows creatures to participate in creation and contribute towards it in a sort of strong sense, that it's coming from themselves. And so because it's coming from themselves, you're going to have this sort of natural depravity within creatures and that develops because of their contributions, ultimately for the end of embettering the world, which I don't know, maybe it is still in a sense a consequentialist theory of
I'm confused about, you both were talking about privation, and how does that fit into what we're talking about with sin? I don't want to go too long on this because I do need to end this fairly soon, but
so I
just
think,
especially when we're talking about causing, or like humans sort of bringing in, I guess, evil, how does it make sense for humans to bring in something that is fundamentally, or cause something that, or anything causing something, God causing something that fundamentally doesn't have a cause by definition? Privation doesn't have a cause. It's only parasitic on something else, but that's not the thing that it's parasitic on, isn't its cause necessarily, right?
So I think that, like, a privation of the
does
good
that make sense?
Will have a cause, but like, let's see. Okay, so you have a lion and a gazelle, where the lion acts towards the good in that its stomach is lacking sustenance to it. And so it eats the gazelle, and that's a privation against the good of the gazelle. And so there's a sort of trade, I guess, that takes place between the good for the lion versus the bad for the gazelle. And then, yeah, there would still be a cause. Like the lion is causing that, not in a strong like moral sense, because I don't think lions are moral creatures, but that's in a sense in how a privation of evil, a privation
So what
of
do
good can be caused.
What is evil? That like I'm confused about. I mean, this is where I think I'm sort of agnostic about the origins of evil specifically.
I don't think it has an origin.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. Bart talks about it in terms of das Nichtige, which is notness or no-ness. If we're going to describe this evil, there's no sort of rational categories that we can use to describe it as a thing, because it, as Samuel was saying, it's not a thing in itself, right? So the language that we use, which is reserved for good creation, can't be applied appropriately to this thing. And so when we specify too much, I think about evil's existence or evil's the cause of evil or whatever. I think that's, I don't know. It worries me a little bit, because I think I think there's a legend about Martin Luther. Someone was asking about where sin came from, and he said something like, "That's a totally inappropriate question to ask. What should happen is you should get your hand smacked with a ruler." That question is so it's so irrational. Not the question itself, but the thing that we're trying to get at is so irrational, so distorting, so not like anything we're able to describe, that it's in some, for me, it's like, why even try to figure that out? The fact that evil has manifested itself or become a sort of parasite on certain good creation, aspects of good creation that God has graciously created, is the case. So why not just talk about that and not try to sort of go behind it, I guess, is my worry.
So there's this sort of mysterious element to evil.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, if there is a sort of mysterious element there, then it seems like that should somewhat lower our certainty regarding like how this mysterious thing that we're not sure how to talk about is in relation to the afterlife. Not to say that like the fact that we don't understand evil entails universalism.
No, because we do have the ways in which that has taken up residence in various aspects of humanity, in the cosmos in general. So yeah, that stuff we can see very obviously. But I'm talking about evil as such, which is nonsensical, right? We can't talk about that thing in itself. So that's why I think notness or no-ness is sort of an appropriate way, if we're going to talk about it, an appropriate description for that thing that we're that has somehow made its way in. Again, I know that this is really weird, but I don't know. Like I'm unhappy with pretty much every other way of talking about it. This kind of gets me to a place as a Christian to say I just don't know how to really explain this other than these weird non-words like notness and no-ness, right?
Right. Yeah, but like I feel like there's a sense in which we can talk about like nothingness or notness and no-ness that's in a non-moral sense. Like if we're saying that God created from nothing, that's a sense in which we're using notness, but not in a like evil. It's not like God had there was an evil world and then God created a good world or anything like that. So I don't know. I like evil is that which is contrary to being, or that which is contrary to the good of things that are being. And like I guess contrary is a somewhat analogical word, because like usually we're using that in regards to propositions and things like that, and it's not like there's this negative proposition that's interacting with the fact of my being. But I don't know, at least when I talk about it that way, it makes the most sense to me that like an evil action is that which is contrary to a thing's being.
An
Yeah.
evil action.
Yeah.
A specific contingent evil action. Yeah, that's slightly different than what I
Okay, I got
was
you.
talking about, but yeah.
Is there anything else?
I don't know where to go, because I mean, I agree with you, John, that like we should understand evil as like a contrariness to being, or a parasitic on goodness in a sense. I just don't think that that account of goodness or metaphysical goodness, or I don't think it makes anything but a universalist account of eschatology like plausible, because once again, like, if it's the case that some people eternally rejected the good, you'd have to say on this classical Thomistic account of metaphysics or whatever, that that their rejection is it's not absolute, it's relative. Like they're choosing. I mean, you said yourself that they're choosing they're choosing lower goods, and they're mistaking them for being the ultimate good, right?
Well,
and so
I wouldn't say mistaking them, but
well,
yeah,
what would you say then? I mean,
they're choosing a lesser good, even in the opportunity to choose the greater good.
But,
and they're doing so knowing that what they're choosing is a lesser good.
So this not okay, but there's still in some sense in which you'd say that they're choosing a lower good over the highest good is a mistake, wouldn't you? Like,
I mean,
objectively, it's metaphysically the case that it's wrong.
I get what you're saying. Yeah, like they should choose the greater good, but yet they do what they should not do. But it's not like they're unaware of this fact. They're doing so intentionally. Like that's what it means to perform an evil action, is to know what the good is and choose otherwise.
To know what the good is in a full sort of sense and do otherwise?
It doesn't need to be in a full sense. Just the fact that, like, I know it would not be good for me to poke Samuel in the eye, and then I choose to do so anyway.
He's in New Zealand, so you can't. Right?
I'm coming for you, bloke.
Because if you're saying that someone everlastingly rejects the good, you'd have to say, I think, that they have. I mean, this is probably where you disagree. I think you'd have to say that they have full knowledge of the good. I mean, you can't absolutely. It seems to me that you want to say that someone can have sufficient but not complete knowledge of the good. Right. Someone can have sufficient knowledge of the good to everlastingly reject it. But I think that's nonsense. I mean, you can never have sufficient knowledge of, like, if you have sufficient knowledge of the good, you would accept it because it's the fulfillment of your nature. I mean, so I don't think it's possible to this idea of like having sufficient freedom to reject God, like yet it not being a full freedom.
Yeah. So do you think that God
would be unfree? Yeah.
Can create a world in which some creatures have a less than the summum bonum as their end? So like a flower, like I can imagine that the end of a flower is to pollinate and bloom and things like that. And God creates a world in which there's a flower that exists, something like that. And that's not like a privation to the flower because its end is fully realized as just a flower. And that's not morally objectionable as a world for God to create, right?
Not in principle, but I would say that if this plant, whatever, if God didn't create in the eschaton, fulfilling its nature, all of these flowers to fulfill its nature, in the new creation, then I would say that that would be obviously morally objectionable. So I don't agree with the usual Thomistic account, which seems to exclude non-rational creatures from the beatific vision. I think that's ultimately an unchristian, anti-Christian, I would even say, eschatology.
Yeah, I guess there's where you might get me to sort of turn against Thomas somewhat in saying that, yeah, animals deserve compensation for the sufferings that they go through in this life, in some sort of afterlife. I don't know if it would be the full beatific vision, but it would at least be some sort of good for that animal, like the fulfillment of whatever fullness of being that a dog can have, or I don't know, a penguin can have, or whatever, any animal that deserves compensation for the suffering it undergoes. It's appropriate for God to bring them to whatever realm in which they can sort of receive that fullness of goodness. Okay, so anyway, from that, recognizing that a flower, if God created a flower whose ultimate end was to bloom and be beautiful and pollinate and all that, but God created that flower in a world in which that telos was restricted so that it couldn't actually achieve that. Let's say a world in which the flower was planted in a pot but had no water, something like that. That would be immoral for God. Maybe it's not immoral for God because the flower's not really conscious.
It would just be contradictory. I wouldn't say. I mean, I don't want to say God is some actions that are moral for God, because I don't want to be God as an agent, a moral agent. But I would say that it's
not
metaphysically impossible.
To his nature. Yeah, gotcha.
God could
Contrary
not possibly.
Yeah, exactly.
God could not possibly do that.
So what I have in mind is imagining the flower requires its active willing for it to bloom. And it's actually not flowers, but a person. A person has an active willing. It requires an active willing of themselves in order to bloom.
Yeah.
Bloom in the sense of like a person accomplishing their greatest ultimate end. And then those people, rather than living as a fully pollinated and blooming flower / person, they're living as a somewhat decrepit flower, and they're not willing any further to become fully bloomed and pollinated. It's a sense in which their existence is still a good, but it's not the ultimate good that they could achieve. And here's where I guess it is a sort of open question or possible contradiction with the general Catholic tradition, where I'd rather leave it open for the damned to be able to ultimately flourish, even if it's the case that they're not going to, but the fact that they have that a possibility open to them at all times, even after death, which I know is going to be something that is pretty. So I don't know. That's I can see how that would maybe be the most moral. And I think like Jerry Walls, his sort of defense of hell is similar to this, in that like, the hell can be set free as soon as they choose to repent, or something like that.
If that's the, I don't think that view is even like maintaining any traditional view of hell, because if you're saying that if you're allowing a second chance at any moment, so there's no cutting off of theosis, essentially. If you're allowing, it's a possibility that even the damned will, be saved, and this is like a real possibility that can be actualized. It's not just like, it's a possibility that can't be actually, Then if you believe that, then you're already rejecting the traditional Catholic view of hell, which is to say that there's no second chances. There's some kind of irrevocability to,
here's
choosing
where
God or not choosing God.
I brought up Thomas Aquinas's position earlier, that like there's a sense in which we can still pray for the redemption of the damned, but not through their own repentance, but through God sort of providing them with the opportunity to repent. And I think the way in which like all Christians, anyone that holds to a traditional view of hell, would have to say that there's a possibility in which the damned can be brought into full theosis, given that God's omnipotent. Like it's like for any, well, I guess maybe they'll say like it's metaphysically impossible for God to do this, maybe because it would be contrary to justice or something like that.
That would be like the one food way of defending. traditional, but you probably don't want to hold that, do you? You want to say that it's possible, like
Yeah, I
because
think.
God's omnipotent.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I want to say it's possible, but it's not a. It's not a, and that's the hopeful universalist view, I guess, that it's possible, but it's not a certainty, and not even a certainty in the sense of like, oh, I'm Cartesian certain that all
Okay.
shall be saved in the end. But even like, I think it should be held as a live possibility that we should hope that we should try to avoid and do our best to avoid our damnation, our own damnation. There's a sense in which like maybe it's better to think that like all shall be saved aside from myself, that like I need to be careful for how I walk this life with the expectation that I deserve hell and shall receive it, but from the grace of God that I'll be able to receive the beatific vision with the saints.
So is hell irrevocable or not?
If it is, it would be irrevocable through the choices of creatures to reject God as the summum bonum and to accept themselves as a lesser good.
But do you think that account of it being irrevocable is plausible?
I think it should be held like it's a live possibility, I'll say.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just because I guess, yeah, that I would just ask, like, why believe that it's a live possibility that someone can irrevocably reject God? Unless you found it like plausible
morally
to view.
I see. Like, why? How could this?
God is
how could this be a live
Yeah.
possibility in conjunction with a perfect being? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put it in those exact terms, but yeah, the idea.
Well,
you're getting at the idea.
Yeah, like I'd agree that there are certain metaphysical, there are certain metaphysically impossible worlds, even though they're perfectly coherent. Like I could say that God cannot like create a world in which all the wicked are eternally rewarded in heaven, while all of the damned are all of the righteous are eternally punished in hell. That would be a metaphysically impossible world for God to create. And you're just wanting to say that, like, well, the world I'm sort of articulating would be similar enough to those types of worlds that it should also be metaphysically impossible for God to create, right?
Right. Yeah, I want to. Yeah, because, like, I think the fundamental thing you need to, like, distinguish is like a live possibility that may or may not be actualized, and a live possibility that is a conditional necessity, in a sense. So, like, it's to put it like, so if what I want to say, I mean, this might sound compatibilist if you. I don't really care, but what I want to say is that if God creates, then it's necessary that all are saved.
Uh-huh.
It's necessary, you know. There's no other possibility, and I know that the usual Catholic response to that would be, God is libertarianly free. God could choose among a range of options. He could have chosen some other world, but whatever.
What you just said, anyway, because like you can say that, like, well, God.
Yeah,
it's not the case that God must create rational creatures.
Yeah,
okay.
And I guess I agree with it in a weak sense. But I don't want to hypothesize this notion of like possibilities or like alternative worlds. You know, like I think and I think that I think in some senses the classical Christian view is actually some idea of conditional necessity of creations. I think that I think it's the case that creation is gratuitous on the one hand. Like it's not necessary in that sense, it's gratuitous, but at the same time it's still necessary that God create. I think it is. I can't imagine any other world where God actually exists by himself and doesn't manifest God's self by creating. I think that's I don't
I mean, hypothetically, you can imagine God as, some
right.
self-subsistent agent, who doesn't choose to create. But I think that's just nonsense. I don't. I think it's necessary that the good, to use language of Dionysius, which Aquinas himself uses, the good is self-diffusive in a necessary way. So, like, the good must share itself and create. Like, in that sense, it's necessary. But just because it's in that sense, it doesn't mean that it's like that necessity, that conditional necessity doesn't make it non-gratuitous, if that makes sense. Like, God is not compelled. I'm not saying that God is compelled either internally or externally to create. I'm not saying that. That's a common, like, sort of straw man, I guess, of like the sort of Neoplatonist view that I hold. Obviously God is not constrained or controlled to do anything, because he's the ground of all possibility, so he can't be constrained by anything. But that doesn't just because God is not constrained by any internal or external factors, that doesn't mean that we can't say at the same time that creation is in some sense necessary, that God has to create. Does that kind of make sense, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think so. Sort of like, maybe like sort of accepting that it's possible for God not to create, but God always would create, something sort of like that. And so maybe it's
hypothetical possibility.
I think that's
and I would
contrary
also
to classical theism, and more so sort of panentheism or something like that. But I mean, it's not like a bad view or anything like that. I would just think that, like, God's
I think it's Aquinas'
desire to share.
I don't think Aquinas is a libertarian in the sense that you're thinking of. I don't think Aquinas views God as like a libertarian agent.
I think there's like discussion regarding whether God must create, and I think Thomas would say no, it's not the case that God must create. And so that would be a sense in which God has the alternate possibility to refrain from creating.
Yeah, Thomas is interesting. He's quite the determinist too. We forget this.
Yes, I'm sure we could like dispute what is the
right
correct understanding of Thomas, which is another discussion, I guess. But
I'm gonna go ahead and call this stream because we've been going for a long time. And we can of course continue these the conversations that came out of this at a different time. But thank you both for doing this. This was really fun. And I'm glad we got to make it happen to have both of you on and to
me too. Yeah, it was great meeting you and talk with you, Samuel. This was a lot of fun. There's a lot in which like we're simpatico and like classical theism in our appreciation of Thomas. And so it is great to be able to like have this sort of shared framework to really iron sharpening iron here. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, no, I definitely see myself as like a kind of reforming Catholic. And that's how I'd like to articulate what Protestantism means. Like I'm not. I don't think. I think a Protestantism that's not engaged with like the broader Catholic tradition is not really a Protestantism worth holding to. Really.
Yeah. Totally agree.
So yeah.
Thank you both.
It's a lot easier to reform from the inside rather than from the outside. I'm just saying.
Is it though?
I'm already in on the inside. The barriers between us are just illusory, ultimately, John. I'm a Catholic.
Yeah, that's true. We're all Catholic. It's just some of us are in a fuller communion with it.
More fulfilled.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
All right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you all for being on the stream. Spartan, I did see your question. I'll pass that along to Samuel and me. We can talk about it later because I don't want to stay on too much longer. But it's a good question about Calvinism. So I see that, Spartan. We'll talk about it later. Thank you, everyone, for being on the live stream and I saw some nice discussion going on. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here. And I'll see y'all later. Bye, everyone.